Yes, having listened to Robin Dunbar, actually, I need to probably rewrite my presentation, but you'll have to bear with me. I think I may have used the term Neolithic settlements maybe too loosely, so maybe you should read towns and cities rather than Neolithic primitive villages. So the Outgroup Intolerance hypothesis, it's a hypothesis of social causation of schizophrenia based on evolutionary theory. It claims to identify the social environmental factors that play a central role in the causation of schizophrenia, while recognizing that environmental influences must interact with genetic vulnerability. Environmental theories of schizophrenia have a checkered history, and many of them have fallen by the wayside, and rightly so. However, there's clearly a need to provide a coherent account of the social and environmental factors that increase the risk of schizophrenia, as it is evident that genetic explanations are not sufficient. For example, we know that monozygotic twins have only a 50% concordance rate. Also, contrary to received wisdom, schizophrenia in fact does not have a uniform incidence and prevalence worldwide. The Outgroup Intolerance hypothesis is a reformulation of Jonathan Burns's cortical disconnectivity theory, in which he proposed that the dysfunction in the social brain that leads to schizophrenia results from aberrant connectivity in the frontotemporal and frontoparietal circuits that arises, in his words, as a costly byproduct of social brain evolution in Homo sapiens. The original cortical disconnectivity theory was based on the assumption of the uniform incidence and prevalence of schizophrenia worldwide. However, the variability in the incidence and prevalence across a range of social settings was problematic for Burns's original formulation. In fact, the new epidemiological findings are problematic for other theories with similar assumptions, such as Tim Crow's theory that schizophrenia is the price to pay for language. That's to say, the inevitable byproduct of the evolution of the language system. However, once Burns became aware of the epidemiological findings that pointed to the wide variations in the incidence and prevalence, he attempted to reformulate his theory to take these findings into account in an article he published in 2009. In this, he outlined the social factors identified by recent epidemiological research and partially incorporated these into his reformulated theory. He proposed a gene-environment approach where, in his words, a spectrum of genetic vulnerability exists in the population, which in the context of a toxic social environment is expressed as a continuum of psychosis. But the precise nature of the pathogenic social environment and the vulnerability were not were incompletely defined in our view. Hence, while we accept the neuropathological and proximate processes that Burns describes in his disconnectivity model, we differ in our reformulation on the issue of the evolutionary or ultimate causation, and I will outline these in a moment. I would suggest that any theory that attempts to integrate the new epidemiological data on schizophrenia must try first to identify the precise stressors the environmental stressors. Second, be consistent with the epidemiological findings. Third, be consistent with findings in schizophrenia in spheres other than epidemiology. And finally, to make predictions about the disorder that are testable and are currently unknown. This is what the Outgroup Intolerance hypothesis attempts to achieve. The hypothesis and its background are described in 2 articles that Mohammed and I published in 2011 and 2014. So, the Outgroup Intolerance hypothesis. It's based on the fact that during more than 99% of human evolutionary history, our ancestors lived as hunter-gatherers in close-knit groups. And we've heard a beautiful description from Professor Dunbar regarding this. As a result, the social brain evolved to deal with the demands of living in such social conditions, surrounded by kin and with a clear delineation between in-group and out-group members. However, here is where I get myself in hot water. I just say in the post-Neolithic, but actually probably it's much more recent than that. New social systems emerged, resulting in a blurring of the demarcation between in-group and out-group individuals, and this reached its peak with the advent of cities. And I think that probably the larger settlements and towns and cities are what we need to focus on, rather than just simply Neolithic villages. So this, according to this hypothesis, this led to a mismatch between the design of the social brain and the novel social environment. And we contend that the novel social environment can exert a detrimental effect on the development and functioning of the social brain, primarily in the domain of intergroup regulation. And that the stress caused by this mismatch is what leads to schizophrenia in genetically vulnerable individuals. So to put it slightly differently, the Outgroup Intolerance hypothesis states that there was a mismatch between, on the one hand, the design of the social brain shaped by selection over thousands of generations within a specific set of social conditions of mobile hunter-gatherer groups bound by enduring social bonds and often ties of kinship, and where there was a strong distinction between in-group and out-group membership and a strong aversion to strangers, and on the other hand, the very different social systems that emerged with the advent of towns and cities. It is hypothesized that the stress caused by this mismatch creates the ground for a developmental perturbation in the cortical connections within the social brain that leads to the syndrome of schizophrenia in vulnerable individuals. So, the hypothesized nature of the environmental stressor, according to this hypothesis, is excessive contact with non-kin or out-group individuals during critical stages of development, or inadequate contact with kin or in-group members during critical stages of development, or some combination of both. And the hypothesized nature of the vulnerability is oversensitivity to the existence of strangers in the social environment, or an impairment in the ability to recategorize or redesignate out-group individuals as in-group members, or some combination of both. It's worth pointing out that while we have proposed that the risk of schizophrenia rose with the blurring of the in-group, out-group boundaries as human settlements increased in size and population densities rose, we have not, in fact, defined the critical density levels or identified the point in human history when such population densities were attained. And you might argue these are weaknesses in our hypothesis. this is an outline of the evidence that I'll be briefly discussing, and due to time constraints, much of this evidence will be mentioned as headlines, but I'll be happy to expand on this during discussion if required. So, it is contended that humans are biologically prepared to divide the social world into those who belong to one's own group or in-group members and outsiders or out-group members, and that human social structures are based on within-group solidarity and between groups enmity, or within-group cooperation and between groups competition. I realise that this is a schematic oversimplification. It is likely that throughout human evolutionary history, encounters with out-group individuals represented a potential threat to personal welfare. There are numerous studies that show that individuals produce a measurable physiological response towards out-group individuals that occur at lightning speeds and are entirely outside conscious awareness. And herein lie the roots of human ethnocentrism and racism that are universal but modifiable human phenomena. In addition, it is of interest that out-group paranoia is common in all societies. Also, it is noted that males are more ethnocentric and xenophobic than females, and are also more likely to dehumanize and use danger-relevant stereotypes about out-group individuals. In other words, it appears that males are more out-group intolerant than females. And when you look at the epidemiological data, this is reflected in the sex ratio of schizophrenia, where there is a preponderance of males. There is an influential evolutionary view that proposes that schizophrenia is primarily a disorder of the social brain. But unfortunately, such thinking has yet to filter through meaningfully into mainstream psychiatry. However, I guess those who interact with schizophrenic patients regularly cannot but notice the profound difficulties such patients have in dealing with their social world. The evidence in support of such a contention comes from clinical experience as well as a wealth of research data. One can think of Bloyler's 3 A's, all of which point to profound social handicap. Others have referred to loss of connectedness with social surroundings and impaired social competence as cardinal features of schizophrenia. There is a large and ever-expanding literature on the specific social deficits in schizophrenic patients, which include social cognitive deficits, as well as impairment in the capacity for empathy, and impairment in the recognition of emotional facial expressions, and so forth. I'll say a little bit more about this when I briefly discuss research involving oxytocin. So, evidence from epidemiology. It has been well recognized that the study of the incidence and distribution of a disease can be instrumental in discovering its causation. One celebrated example of this is the discovery of the etiology of cholera in 1854 by John Snow, not very far away from where we are today. There are, of course, massive differences between a chronic and complex disorder such as schizophrenia and a relatively straightforward infectious disease as cholera. But I think that it's worth making the point that epidemiology can provide important clues regarding causation in a general sense. Until relatively recently, there was a widely held view that there is little variation in the incidence and prevalence of schizophrenia across societies and cultures. Indeed, some texts continue to repeat this claim. However, this has been thoroughly challenged, and there is now mounting and robust evidence that the incidence that show that the incidence varies enormously between countries and communities. In summary, the risk factors include being male, being a migrant, both first and second generation, being a member of an ethnic minority, and living in a low own group ethnic density area are all risk factors. Also, being a member of a more visible ethnic minority by reason of race or culture seems to increase the risk. This is the sex ratio that I referred to earlier. It's male to female 1.4 to 1 with a male preponderance. So, evidence from migration. These are the findings of two large meta-analyses which showed increased risk in first and second generation immigrants. Rather intriguingly, Van Os has suggested that the negative effects of migration seem to be cancelled out if the move is from a situation of social exclusion into a situation of social inclusion. For social exclusion, read outgroup status. For social inclusion, read in-group membership, which is, in my view, supportive of the outgroup intolerance hypothesis. Evidence from urbanicity. A meta-analysis of 10 studies showed a pooled effect size of 1.7. Krabendam and Van Os concluded that the relationship may be causal, as it explains about 30% of the incidence. Also, they concluded that the effect is consistent across cultures and shows a dose-response relationship. That's to say, the longer you grow up in an urban environment, the higher your risk of developing schizophrenia. Evidence from ethnic minority status. Studies have shown increased risk in ethnic minorities, and the increased risk is inversely proportional to the population density in a given locality. I've already referred to the greater risk in more visible minorities by reason of race or culture. Also, interestingly, high levels of own group ethnic density appear to be a protective factor against schizophrenia. So it's clear that migration, urbanization, ethnic minority status, and low ethnic density are all associated with greater exposure to outgroup individuals. Other evidence, the age of onset, peak age of onset is late adolescence, early adulthood, and this is the age of departure from family, independence, and greater exposure to outgroup influences. Evidence from psychopathology. In schizophrenia, hypervigilance and over-attribution of malicious intentions to others suggests that the mechanisms involved in the evaluation of social threats are overactive. Also, a large proportion of positive symptoms relate to the theme of threat. Think of persecutory delusions, third-person auditory hallucinations, and some first-rank symptoms. Also, interestingly, the majority of auditory hallucinations have been found to be of male voices. And of course, in the ancestral environment, the risk from outgroups emanated primarily from males. In addition, negative symptoms may be considered to be a form of withdrawal from threatening social contact. So, the majority, but not all, of the symptoms of schizophrenia are consistent with this disorder being a dysregulation in the systems governing the relationship with outgroup members. Of course, when I say not all, there are some recurring important symptoms such as disorganized thoughts or grandiosity, which cannot be explained by the outgroup intolerance model. So, evidence from research on oxytocin. At the time of the publication of our first article in 2011, we were not aware of the possible relevance of oxytocin to the outgroup intolerance hypothesis, as at that time some key articles were either published at the same time or not yet published. We acknowledge that the data and knowledge of the actions of oxytocin and its relevance to schizophrenia is a complex and unfolding area which might not be easy to interpret. But with this in mind, recent research on oxytocin does appear, at least on the face of it, to be relevant to the outgroup intolerance hypothesis. Two independent lines of research involving oxytocin are of particular interest. One is the claim that oxytocin provides the biological basis for in-group solidarity, trust, favoritism, ethnocentrism, and indirectly causes outgroup disfavor and hostility. It's been claimed that oxytocin enables the categorization of others into in-group and outgroup, enables the development of trust, and also upregulates neural circuitries involved in empathy and concern for others. The second line of research is one that suggests that oxytocin has antipsychotic properties, including being implicated in the mode of action of clozapine, and also that it can correct an array of social deficits in schizophrenic patients. I'd specifically like to highlight one particular piece of research which was published in Psychological Medicine 2014 by Abu Akel et al. This group compared schizophrenic patients with controls, both of whom received oxytocin, on their level of empathy towards in-group and out-group individuals with pain and non-pain scenarios. Their main finding was that oxytocin increased empathy to out-group pain individuals in controls, but not in schizophrenic patients. As far as I know, this was the first time that that schizophrenic patients were compared to controls in their response to outgroup individuals. And not surprisingly, we were extremely interested in this finding. So we contacted the authors and then wrote a response that was published in Psychological Medicine together with the author's response. Although the authors arrived at their design from a completely different set of theoretical assumptions, they agreed that their findings were consistent with the outgroup intolerance hypothesis. Despite the fact that oxytocin failed to normalize the response of schizophrenic patients to the outgroup pain scenarios, we still believe that such normalization may be feasible if patients were treated with oxytocin at an early stage of their illness, that's to say before the neuropathological changes reached an advanced stage. Other evidence, there is a long-standing and strong claim in the literature of improved prognosis in developing countries despite poor mental health services. We're aware that this claim has been challenged, but in our view, this remains a credible and intriguing finding. Although this is not core to the outgroup intolerance hypothesis, it is, we think, supportive of it. Also, as far as we know, there is absence of reports of schizophrenia in hunter-gatherers who were uncontaminated by contact with settled human communities. And this is we appreciate that this is anecdotal, and this question may, in fact, not be answerable any longer, as no such human groups exist in the world any longer. So, question: is schizophrenia a dysfunction of the cultural brain? I'm going to be leaving this question hanging in the air to some extent because the time available only allows for very brief explanatory remarks. Humans have been described as a cultural species, and although culture is not unique to humans, it is clear that human culture has unique properties not shared by other species, including our closest ape relatives. One of the consequences of human culture is the widening of the in-group. And by the way, the in-group is not the same as the social circle that Robin Dunbar was referring to. The in-group can be much wider than that. The widening of the in-group and the creation of symbolically marked tribal-level societies. This is a unique human characteristic that has effectively removed the ceiling on the possible size of the human in-group. Humans are biologically prepared to act as members of a tribe, but this requires individuals to be culturally competent and to have the capacity to process cultural markers to determine who belongs to their tribe. This involves the ability to process a complex set of cultural rules that govern dealings with fellow tribe members as opposed to outsiders. Hence, an important question here is, does outgroup intolerance lead to the dysregulation of the neurobiological systems that specifically support cultural competence? This is obviously, there's much more that one can say about this, but and I realize that this entails a further reformulation of the hypothesis. So, a number of predictions arise from the outgroup intolerance model. One is that there will be a gradient of prevalence for schizophrenia in societies worldwide, depending on the degree to which a given society departs from the conditions of the environment of evolutionary adaptedness. Hence, the greater the probability of living in large groups with many strangers, the higher the incidence and prevalence of schizophrenia and vice versa. Prediction 2, there will be a gradient of prognosis that follows similar principles to prediction 1. 3, patients with schizophrenia will show more sensitivity to outgroup individuals, that's to say on physiological measures, than controls, and this might extend to first-degree relatives. For members of the majority or host population who live in neighborhoods with high-density immigrant populations will be at increased risk of schizophrenia. This may partly explain the increased incidence of schizophrenia in urban settings. 5, members of an immigrant population with greater numbers of immigrant kin in the host country will experience reduced risk of schizophrenia compared to those with few or no immigrant kin. 6, families who are less culturally assimilated, whether in the host community or in their own immigrant group, confer a greater risk of schizophrenia upon their children than those who are highly assimilated, and this may interact with the kinship circle, which may ameliorate the effects of lack of assimilation. 7, step parentage during critical stages of development may be a risk factor for schizophrenia, and we're thinking more of short-term step parentage, such as less than 12 months or less than 2 years. And finally, 8, this may not, strictly speaking, be a prediction, but it's a possibility that arises from the outgroup intolerance model and the research on oxytocin, which is that oxytocin used at an early stage of schizophrenia may permanently correct the deficit where the threshold for designating others as in-group members may be set too high, leading to an excess of outgroup designations. Limitations. The outgroup intolerance theory is a theory of ultimate causation that does not explain the proximate mechanisms causing the disorder. Specifically, it does not explain how the stress of outgroup intolerance causes the neuropathological changes in the brain, and the outgroup intolerance cannot account for a range of other environmental factors, such as the use of cannabis as a causative factor. So, in conclusion, schizophrenia, the outgroup intolerance hypothesis contends that schizophrenia is a relatively novel human phenomena that has only arisen since humans became settled and after frequent exposure to outgroup individuals became common. Schizophrenia is essentially caused by social factors that interact with a genetic vulnerability, that the toxic element in the environment is the existence of perceived strangers that produces an exaggerated, persistent threat response in some individuals, and this leads to aberrant development of the social brain. And we believe that the hypothesis can explain a range of features of schizophrenia that have remained inexplicable thus far. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Riadh, for bringing us back to psychiatry. Putting your head on the block.
I have, especially following Robin Dunbar's brilliant presentation. I realized that I have to rewrite some of the stuff.
I have two questions. I'll take Chairman's prerogative here. The first question is, how does what you've been telling us perhaps connect with Robin Dunbar's account of how the social brain takes so long to mature in humans? What might be the relation there? And the other one is, are you actually excluding intrafamiliar variables, not genetic but developmental, social intrafamiliar variables, as being relevant to the causation of schizophrenia?
So your first question is about the delay in the maturation of the social brain. I mean, I see this as consistent with the hypothesis that I've put forward, as the risk period does, appear to be consistent with a late maturation. There is, of course, outliers that with very late onset, which doesn't seem to fit, but those are small in numbers, and the bulk of what we call schizophrenia occurs during the window that we sort of expect for the maturation of the social brain and the frontal lobes that has been referred to. So I see this as being supportive of the hypothesis. Your second point regarding intrafamilial factors, of course one cannot exclude any such issues, and I mean, I've put the issue about step parentage, which I believe has not been researched, and it's an open question. But other factors such as early abuse within the family may well be a factor, and I see that as probably evidence of mismatch. Our current nuclear family structure is a very abnormal, in terms of human history. It's a very abnormal situation where small family units are cut off from the extended family that humans during evolutionary history had universally, and I think this is beautifully described by Hardy, well, HRDY, in I think Mothers and Others, her well-known book, where she describes the rearing of children being a collective activity, and that is how humans. That's the environment in which humans evolved. So if there is increased abuse during childhood, and I think there is evidence for that, this might be one aspect of mismatch. That this is a novel situation that humans have faced, and this may well be a further etiological factor for schizophrenia. But I think that's in a sense nothing to do with the outgroup intolerance hypothesis.
I'm wondering if it is nothing to do with it. I'm thinking of Peter Fonagy's hypothesis about the centrality of the communication of cultural information through what he would call the establishment of epistemic trust. And there is some connection between early attachment and trauma, the report of early experience of trauma by the vast majority of certainly people suffering from personality disorder. I'm not aware of what the evidence is around schizophrenia, but you can begin to sketch out a connecting mechanism there where it may well be that one of the outcomes of intrafamilial trauma is that you don't learn the cultural symbols and mechanisms that underpin your ability to recognise an expanded in-group, out-group. And I've got knocking around my head, I think was it Paul Seabright who wrote that book, The Company of Strangers, and I've forgotten what he said. It feels as though it ought to be very relevant.
Economists don't believe it.
But it is all about how human beings tolerate living in large groups, and it seems to me, I can't remember what he says, but I don't know if you've read the book. But
No, I haven't. I haven't.
Next to what you're talking about.
I'd be very, interested to have a look at that. Well, thank you for drawing my attention to that, because I haven't read that book at all.
Well, first,
I'm Simon, I'm a retired military psychiatrist. One criticism often made about an evolutionary approach is that most of the significant mental disorders we see will reduce biological fitness, and therefore a dormant selfish gene that you would have thought would respond by dying away. Now, I think they've got an idea why this might not be occurring, but can you make a comment about that generally?
Oh, generally, yes. I was going to say that the outgroup intolerance is a theory of mismatch. So it, yeah. I mean, being a theory of mismatch, it gets round the problem of the low fertility, because what happens here is that genes that may be useful in certain environments, sort of interacting with certain toxic environments, can then produce a disorder. But they don't have to if they don't encounter that particular environment. So the genes themselves may not actually reduce fertility. It's not a universal sort of characteristics of these genes. Certainly it would be a problem if there was a one-to-one relationship between a gene and a condition that reduces fertility. Then there needs to be an explanation then as why are these genes surviving. But with a mismatch that sort of specifies the interaction with a given set of environmental conditions, that the relationship becomes more complex. Yeah, but I mean, I don't know whether anyone else wants to answer the general question about fitness. Yeah.
I think the thing is that the things that are more clearly diseases have a different sort of evolutionary explanation than something which is clearly a defense mechanism which has got a rely on mismatch. There are also things called new mutations. And I think Professor Leslie, I don't think it'll be in his talk today, maybe it will, talks about the cliff edge model and schizophrenia. Is that right?
I'm not going to talk about it, but I'm sure going to talk with Riadh about it.
And that we have a social brain that is right on the bit like the racehorse is exquisitely selected for racing, but can very easily break a neck. And sometimes the social brain may be, the price we pay is the number of casualties during the race.
It's Andrew at the back, and then I'll come to you. Andrew, did you have a question? Yes.
Right, okay. I was interested by your comment that some positive features of psychosis are difficult to explain.
Yes.
The framework of this particular hypothesis. And you mentioned grandiosity.
Yes.
It just strikes me that one of the, as a kind of defense mechanism for people experiencing acute psychosis in particular, grandiosity in a kind of social fantasy sense transcends the 150 number. And it led me to, what I mean by that is that charismatic individuals who are, as it were, in imagination, grandiose individuals who one might imagine as kings in Mesolithic city-states, small kind of primitive or early civilizations following the advent of agriculture and so on, might act as a kind of model in the internal world for a person or an individual who would, as it were, resolve the problem of the outgroup by appealing to a much larger group of people. So in many psychotic individuals, the content of their delusions has this grandiose character, so it will involve powerful individuals who clearly have a kind of unifying effect, as it were, in fantasy at least, or might resolve the problem of, feeling as if one doesn't belong. Now, I appreciate this could sound like a just so story, but I throw it in because,
The answer is I don't know. I mean, it does sound a rather complicated sort of explanation to me. So the answer is I don't know.
Over lunch. Last question, 2 questions, and we finish. Yeah.
Retired psychiatrist from Oxford. I thought your hypothesis was a very interesting one, Riadh. And I was wondering about the process that we're told probably did occur in evolutionary time, that is, of the splitting of groups. Maybe when the group reaches the size of 150, that a split occurs, so that there's a transition from being in-group members to out-group members.
Yes.
And presumably in the run-up to that, there is a period of increasing tension where there is uncertainty about the relationships between various members. So it makes me just a bit more uncertain about this notion that perhaps your model is strengthened by the fact that there may not have been psychotic illnesses in early evolutionary time, when that transition seems to me to encompass some of the features. So your thoughts about that?
Yeah, well, reading John Price and Stephen's book, is it Prophets and Shamans? Is that the title of it? The same thought came to me that there might be actually a connection between what Price and Stevens were talking about in that book and the Outgroup Intolerance, even though there hasn't been really any connection or dialogue between these two theories or hypotheses. But they do talk about group splitting, and they also talk about shamans having who actually do experience quasi-psychotic symptoms, but are not labelled as such. They're not labelled as being ill at the time, who actually lead the split. And actually I have wondered whether, in fact, one can look at both of these models, the outgroup intolerance and the group splitting hypothesis that Price and Stevens have described. And I think there is something there, personally, that maybe connects the two, but I'm not quite sure how it can be formulated. There's also a book by Joe Palemini called Shamans.
Yeah, Shamans amongst us.
Shamans amongst us, yes, Shamans amongst us, and he describes his view is that schizophrenia actually was an adaptive response to the group splitting situation, and that they are relics in the current environment of those individuals who led the group splitting. I mean, I have doubts that this is the case, but it's an intriguing formula. It's an intriguing formulation, rather, which has there are some echoes of the Outgroup Intolerance there. I mean, both books are really lovely reads, but some of the stuff that is in them is highly speculative. And my problem with both of those hypotheses is that they don't produce predictions, or at least they don't produce clear predictions, which makes them testable.
Okay, last question.
It wasn't a question actually, it was just a comment regarding your question about reproductive fitness and mental disorders. I think having an evolutionary framework in psychiatry would or will allow the future generation to ask those questions and investigate them in more detail, because it's not necessarily the case that mental disorders induce reproductive fitness. I think the ADHD would be a good example, and there are many others.
Substance abuse may increase high activity or quantity through people. You see drug addicts, what was it that someone the other day had 29 children who would be put in prison for? So... Yes,
and maybe can I have a last word? There is a rival hypothesis by Selton and Cantor-Gray, who are also now joined with Van Os. The summary of it is published in World Psychiatry of this month, and it's the social defeat hypothesis. They've now renamed, well, they haven't renamed it, but they have a subtitle for it, which is the social exclusion hypothesis. Now, it sounds very much like the Outgroup Intolerance hypothesis now, rather than the social defeat hypothesis that it originally was. So I would, suggest that people have a look at that. It's in World Psychiatry. It's open access, so anyone can download it from the internet. And it's just a page and a half, and but they have no theoretical background to it. It's just saying that this is the epidemiological finding. Social exclusion seems to be associated with the risk of schizophrenia, and they call that social defeat. But actually, it's not defeat, it's exclusion, what they're describing.
Thank you.